In this edition of 5 for Fun, I'm going to use the Atari 2600 and the Xbox 360 to illustrate 5 ways that video games have changed over the last 30 years. 2 consoles separated by 3 decades, 2 icons of the industry, and by analyzing the top 100 selling games on each of these systems, we can begin to see some concrete ways that our favorite pastime has evolved. Number 5. Total software sales volume. Now keep in mind that the 360 sold many more consoles than the 2600, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Collectively, the top 100 selling games on the Atari 2600 sold somewhere around 90 million copies. Impressive, right? Well, 30 years later, the top 100 selling games on the Xbox 360 would sell north of 400 million units. Massive! Now of course, as I said, the 360 sold more consoles than the 2600, so that's naturally going to inflate the differences in game sales. In fact, the 360 sold approximately 2.8 times more consoles than the 2600. So let's do some very simple math and multiply the 90 million games on the 2600 by 2.8 to try and account for that difference in the install base. It's a rudimentary approach, but at least it's something. This puts the total for the 2600 hypothetically at around 250 million games sold for those 100 bestsellers. That's still far lower than the 360's number. This is some real evidence to suggest that tie ratios, that is to say the number of games that the average system owner purchases, seems to be higher in modern times than it was in the Atari's day. Now we'd have to look at each and every system to confirm this, but I would be willing to bet that it would bear out. Number 4. The age of sequels. It's only natural that later systems will have more sequels than earlier systems, but this is really extreme stuff here. Of the top 100 selling 2600 games, only 7 of them appeared to be a sequel of an earlier game. Less than 10%, but on the 360, the number is 69. Now many of these sequels are sports games, so let's remove those. And that still leaves us with 54 games that are sequels, over half of the bestsellers. It's pretty jarring to look at this list and see all of these sequels. And it makes you wonder, are there so many sequels because they sell so well? Or did they sell so well because they're sequels? Either way, sequels are the new normal, and a definite way in which the game industry has evolved over the last 30 years. Number 3. Genres. Looking at the distribution of top 100 sellers by genre really gives us a peek at how the industry and gamer tastes have changed over the last 3 decades. Nearly half of the 2600's top sellers were simple action games, and another big chunk, 22 of them, were those classic style shooters. And while some of the 360's bestsellers also fit in the action genre, it's the first-person shooter genre that emerged and is home to a quarter of the best-selling 360 games. A genre that didn't even really exist on the 2600. Just over a fifth of the 360's bestsellers were sports games, another small category on the 2600, and finally RPGs accounted for 11% of the bestsellers on the 360 compared to 0 on the 2600. The landscape of the type of game that sells well has certainly changed over the last 3 decades. Number 2. Publishers. On the 2600, 59% of the top-selling games were published by third parties, and 41% were published by Atari themselves. Compare this to the 360, where a massive 80% of top sellers were published by third parties, leaving only 20% that were published by Microsoft. This marks one of the biggest differences between the 2 eras. Atari used to be incredibly important to their own success, but in modern times, consoles publishers are much more diverse. Notably, one publisher, the very first third-party publisher in gaming history, had many of the best-selling games on both the 2600 and the 360. It's Activision, a company that published more than 20 of the top sellers on the 2600 and 12 on the 360. That's an impressive track record across a really long stretch of time. And in fact, there was only one other third-party publisher that managed to cross that 30-year bridge. Can you guess which one? It's Sega, with 1 bestseller on the 2600 and 1 on the 360. And it's really interesting to look at the list of publishers that published those best-selling games on the 2600. Not too many of them are still in existence today. These are names that would be foreign to most of today's gamers. Number 1. Timing. If we look at the distribution of the top 100 selling 360 games by the year that they were released, the pattern looks much as we'd reasonably expect. Some bestsellers early on, more in the middle, and then tapering off as the system grew older. This is a fairly normal distribution. But when we switch to the 2600, things are drastically different. I love this. Here we see just a smattering of bestsellers early in the system's life, and then suddenly a massive amount in 1981 and 1982, followed by a cliff-like drop to close out the rest of the 1980s. And of course, that cliff was the great video game crash of 1983 that extended until about 1985. And by that time, Nintendo was on the scene and the 2600 could never really get back on its feet. I would imagine that the 2600 is likely the first and only console that had a sales distribution like this for its bestsellers. Truly a remnant of a different time. The beginning of the gaming industry where hard lessons were learned and scars were developed. Are there other systems that you'd like to see this kind of analysis for? Let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to find the data and run the analysis. Thanks for watching, and until next time, all the best and the sky's the limit.